Chapter 43. Jack Comes Home. Jack's vision was filled with color and pitch-black darkness, sound and silence, fixed movement. He closed his eyes, hugging Jaime to his chest, and let himself fade out of existence into the place between time and space. And then they were back, and they were falling. Jack's eyes shot open. Underneath him was a vast white landscape, one which in any normal person's eyes would have looked bleak and unforgiving, but which made Jack's chest flare with joy. The North Pole. Jack would have laughed if he hadn't been so tired, but then he remembered he was carrying a child and they were still falling. Baby Tooth zoomed around his head, all but screaming at him to wake up. He gritted his teeth and steered them out of their freefall. The effort made black spots appear in his vision. "Wind!" he yelled, his voice breaking. But the wind heard him anyway and gave him the push he needed in the direction of the workshop. Jack assumed they'd appeared in the exact same spot where the time fragment had swallowed them. It was as if no time had passed at all. Maybe that even was the case, somehow. He looked down at Jaime, who had passed out, but Jack had expected as much. Traveling through time was no bed of roses, even after spending months with dragon-riding Vikings. The workshop came into view. It looked no different than what it always had, no trace of the attack whatsoever. Jack aimed for the dome containing the globe and slipped in through the window, floating down to where Jaime had lain passed out the last time he was here. He landed on unsteady legs and wobbled over to the couch. The fireplace was crackling, as if someone had just been sitting there, though Jack knew that was just the magical workshop keeping itself warm. He carefully laid Jaime on the couch and kneeled in front of him, checking if he was all right. Jaime's face was relaxed and his breath even. Jack brushed some hair out of his face and felt himself smile. "Told you I'd get you back," he whispered. "Jack?" Jack's breath caught in his throat. He looked up to see North. His appearance was shabbier than usual, holding a huge mug of what Jack could choose to believe was hot chocolate, but it wasn't steaming, so it might as well be something stronger. His mouth hung open, and his eyes were wide and confused, as if he thought he was hallucinating. "North," Jack breathed. He didn't register that he'd moved, and he didn't know where he'd stored that extra burst of energy, but in the next moment he found himself throwing his arms around North, clinging to him like his life depended on it. North gave a surprised yelp, and Jack heard the mug fall to the floor. He didn't care. North gave a huff of air, stumbling back a step, and then he was hugging Jack back. Jack only realized he'd never hugged North like this when he got his breath squeezed out of him, and he made a sound somewhere between a wheeze and a laugh. Babytooth zipped happily around them, demanding North give her attention as well, which was probably the only reason North eventually let Jack out of the hug. "But how?" North asked, his voice faint with shock, looking at them like he still wasn't sure they were there, especially Jack. "You are spirit again. What are you wearing? When did you get back?" Jack's throat was so tight with joy, he found it hard to speak. It's a long story," he managed. "But we did it. He stopped, remembering that they hadn't done everything yet. "The time fragment. What happened?" North shook himself out of his stupor. "Sandy has it trapped," he said, looking up at the window over the globe. "But he can't hold him forever. We need Crystal to—" "All right, where is he?" Jack said, fumbling with his satchel. He wrapped his hand in his cloak before taking out the crystal, just to be sure. North's eyes went wide again when he saw it. "How did you—" "I'll tell you later," Jack said. "Where's Sandy?" Over workshop," North said, his eyes flickering between Jack's face and the crystal. "Far above. Jack, are you sure you know what you are doing?" Jack looked at the crystal, turning it around in his hand. "No, but I'm sure it'll be all right," he said, sending North a light smile. "It always is in the end, somehow. Watch over Jaime for me." He nodded at Jaime's sleeping form before kicking off the floor and darting out the window again. Once past the initial strain of traveling through time, Jack felt his powers return to him. Or maybe that was just adrenaline surging through him at the sight of the giant golden thing hovering right above the cloud layer. Jack almost fell out of the sky again. It was just an enormous sphere of dream sand, with shifting and writhing spikes and tendrils protruding from it, sometimes taking almost discernible shapes, but never long enough to be identified. It was like seeing the inner workings of a fever dream. And floating on a small patch of dream sand beside it, just a dot in comparison, was the Sandman. Jack flew up to him, but his excitement to see him faltered when he saw the state Sandy was in. He had his eyes closed, and there was a haze around him, as if he was slowly dispersing. "Sandy?" Jack said, softly as not to startle him. There was no response. Jack thought he knew why. Sandy was using so much power keeping the time fragment imprisoned, he'd entered some kind of deep, meditative, all but comatose state. Though his face was completely blank, Jack could only imagine the strain he was under. He had to act fast. He flew closer to the giant sphere. Though it was made entirely out of Sandy's familiar dream sand, the size of it made Jack's chest tighten with fearsome awe. He knew Sandy was the oldest of the Guardians and one of the most powerful spirits in the world, but it was impossible to imagine just looking at him. Tiny, mellow Sandy. Seeing this thing really renewed Jack's respect for him. He'd be sure to tell him that later, assuming they got out of this in one piece. As he got closer to the sphere, the crystal in his hand began glowing. He took that as a good sign. He approached the dream sand and hesitantly reached out. The dream sand parted between his fingers like it had always done, but didn't shape itself to dolphins or anything at all. Instead, the dream sand coiled around his hand for a moment before a vortex the same size as himself suddenly twisted in front of him, flurrying inwards until he stood before a tunnel. "Okay," Jack said slowly. "Sandy, I hope that was you and not the time fragment?" He flew into the tunnel. Worryingly, the tunnel closed behind Jack as he ventured into the sphere. In turn, the tunnel grew before his eyes, but constantly shifted and changed. He tried shutting the phrase, "the belly of the beast," out of his head as he clutched the crystal and headed onwards. He preserved his strength by walking instead of flying, but the dream sand felt weird under his bare feet. The tunnel walls kept fluctuating, pressing in on him, then swelling again like a swallowing throat. His head and arms brushed against the walls, and the dream sand flurried in response. At first, the shapes it made were too abstract to make any sense of, but then, as he got closer to what he assumed was the center of the sphere, he started glimpsing things. At first, it was just the flash of something that could be a face, or just Jack's imagination. Then, for a moment, he got the feeling someone was walking beside him, but when he turned, there was only curling dream sand. Jack swallowed heavily and trudged on, only to come to a halt when the tunnel softly collapsed and recollected itself into a miniature shape of a night fury. It flew across the tunnel, the walls bending themselves to accommodate its flight. Jack ducked as it flew over his head, and when he turned, it was gone. His breath was shaky when he exhaled. Suddenly, he wasn't so certain if Sandy was the one who had let him in. Sandy wouldn't taunt him like this. He kept going, and the shapes became clearer. He saw images that, no matter how elusive or vague they were, he immediately recognized. The silhouette of Berg's Mountain, the gates to the dragon arena. 3 figures, 1 dragon and 2 boys, sitting on the edge of a cliff, talking properly together for the first time. If anyone else had seen them, Jack was sure they wouldn't have been able to discern what they were looking at, but he did. There was no sound, and yet when the Night Fury flew through the tunnel again, this time with the 2 boys riding it, he swore he could hear their voices. The images burst to life every time Jack accidentally brushed against the walls, or even just took another step forward. Sandy had no way of knowing what had happened in the past, and so Jack started to understand what was going on. Wherever this tunnel ended, the time fragment would be waiting for him there. It had been trapped in here for months, thrashing and fighting against Sandy's magic. They already knew that his dream sand could be corrupted, as Pitch had demonstrated last Easter, and the time fragment had been in Jack's head before. Jack saw glimpses of himself and Jaime and Hiccup and all the people he'd met on Berg. He saw himself beside Stoic as the chief gave a toast. He saw Roughnet and Toughnut trying to grab Babytooth after seeing her for the first time. He saw a group of friends sitting around a table, raising tankards to the sky. Most of the images were small versions of the scenes, just paintings, which Jack could turn his eyes away from if he needed to. But sometimes the dream sand gathered into life-sized shapes of people, gesticulating and running and moving as if they were alive. It got to the point where Jack just stared at his feet as he walked, ignoring the soft rustling of the shifting sand. He wasn't sure what made him look up when he did. The tunnel was narrow. Jack's shoulders were brushing the walls on either side of him. There was no way to bypass the figure standing in front of him, entirely made of gold, but somehow still so lifelike. Even without discernible irises, Dream Sand Hiccup looked right at Jack. Jack stood very still. Then he closed his eyes and walked forward. Dream sand fluttered around him, tickling his face and hands. When Jack looked back, the tunnel was empty. With a deep breath, he turned ahead again, and when he did, spotted something at the end of the tunnel. An opening. He forced his legs to move, walking unhurriedly, unwillingly, towards that flickering thing framed with gold. The tunnel opened into something like a cavern, and there it was. Jack still couldn't quite comprehend what he was looking at. It scared him, even though he'd been prepared for it. The only thing that was different this time was that the time fragment seemed scared of him too. The disembodied lights that were its eyes shimmered too brightly, as if desperate. As Jack stared, trying to make sense of it, he felt as if the Snow Queen were slipping thoughts that weren't his own into his head again, except this time it was flashes of memories. The smell of the great hall, the texture of Toothless's scales, the flash of bright green eyes in a night sky full of freckles, Hiccup's laugh. Jack understood. The time fragment wasn't just begging for its freedom. It was offering Jack a way back. Hiccup had forgotten about him, but maybe he would remember if he saw Jack again. The fairy's curse wouldn't come back, not after they'd erased its existence. And if he didn't remember, then the time fragment would have swallowed Jack's magic, properly this time, so Hiccup could get to know Jackson Overland all over again. It wasn't perfect, but Jack knew how to be patient. They could know each other again. Jack could be human again. He could live and grow up and grow old with him, and he would never be alone again. But the time fragment would still be free. Jack closed his eyes. He kicked off into the air and held the crystal out. Through his eyelids, he saw it glow a bright blue, and the dream sand whirled around him like a hurricane. And then the glow subsided and was replaced by the white light of day. Jack opened his eyes. The giant sphere was gone, and so was the time fragment. Jack put the crystal back into his satchel and turned around. Sandy still sat on the golden cloud. Jack flew over to him. He touched his shoulder. "Sandy, it's okay. You can wake up now." Jack didn't know where he got his confidence from. Sandy was usually a lot harder to wake up. But just a few seconds after Jack spoke, his eyelids fluttered open, and he blinked slowly at Jack. Jack smiled at him. "You did it," he said. "It's gone." Sandy seemed to sigh. Then he smiled before his eyelids closed again and the cloud dispersed. Even while unconscious, he still only floated slowly downwards instead of plummeting, and Jack caught him easily. It wasn't hard to tell this sleep wasn't meditative, but just a genuinely exhausted shutdown. Jack could hear that the rest of the Guardians had arrived as he swooped in through the window. They were talking in excited but hushed voices, probably as to not wake Jaime, though Jack was pretty sure nothing would wake Jaime in the next few hours. But the conversation came to a sudden stop when Tooth spotted him. Despite her effort to be quiet, her voice reached an impressive octave as she darted towards him. "Jack! Oh, Jack, Wait, I'm holding Sandy," Jack said before she could throw her arms around him. Tooth stopped short, freezing mid-air except for her wings. "Sandy, is he okay?" "Just resting," Jack said with a soft laugh. He flew down and deposited Sandy in one of the huge armchairs by the fireplace, and after making sure he was comfortable, not that comfort was any criteria for a good nap in Sandy's case, he turned to Tooth and opened his arms. He caught Tooth, and the force of her impact made them spin in the air. "See, told you he was here in flesh and blood," he heard North say to Bunny, who was gawking at Jack, his ears limp with shock. "I thought," Bunny croaked, "I thought we lost you." Jack tried for a hearty scoff, but it came out too shaky. He leapt over to Bunny, hesitated for a moment before hugging him too. "You have so little faith in me," he mumbled, face halfway pressed into Bunny's fur. Bunny was stiff at first, and who could blame him? Jack had never been so physically affectionate before, but managed to hug him back before Jack felt so flustered he had to pull away. Jack stepped away and just looked at his guardians, not knowing what to say. A part of him was just as shocked as they were that he was back. He had spent so much time worrying about how and if he'd return, he had barely had time to consider just how much he'd missed them, and now the overflow of emotion left him speechless. But before anyone could find their voice again, Jack became aware of a peculiar noise, the approach of 100 bells chiming in unison. In the next moment, a wave of elves burst around the corner. The idea that they had to be silent was promptly thrown out the window, because the elves had not gotten the memo. Most people do not know what it's like to be overrun by a magical workshop's worth of Christmas elves. Jack suddenly had a lot to say about it. They completely ignored North's half-hearted orders to quiet down, jingling happily, clamoring for Jack's attention, blowing party horns, which they seemingly pulled out of thin air, because Jack was sure they hadn't been holding them the moments before, and Jack could only laugh, unable to stay on his feet as the elves jumped and danced around him. Only a few seconds later, Phil showed up and bellowed to the other Yetis what Jack could only assume was an official announcement. Jack had returned. Needless to say, being the center of attention of countless elves and Yetis was both fun and terrifying. It took a while before things started to calm down, and then even longer for North to convince the elves and Yetis to get back to what they were doing, but only after promising a big feast later to properly celebrate Jack's and Jaime's return and the time fragment's defeat. Jaime was still out cold, despite the ruckus. Bunny sat down in one of the armchairs, looking so exhausted one would have thought it was he who had just jumped through time. He was fidgeting with a paintbrush as if he was about to start painting eggs, which he often did when he was stressed, or if he was happy, or angry. Either way, Jack waved a hand in his direction and watched as a snowflake landed on his nose. "You didn't really think we wouldn't make it through this, did you?" Jack asked with a self-satisfied smirk, as if he hadn't been plagued by doubt every day for the past month. Bunny perked up for a moment before he squinted at Jack. "I saw that," he said, but there was no real annoyance in his scowl. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your eyes must be going bad from staring at those eggs all day." Tooth giggled and came to Jack's side again, taking his hands and squeezing them tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Jack," she said, her eyes a little shinier than usual. "We all are," North said, his eyes gleaming. "Now, are you going to tell us how you did it or not?" Jack patted the satchel lightly. "The time fragment is in here," he said, "and the crystal again." "Yes, but how?" Tooth insisted. "Where were the other pieces? How did you get back?" Well," Jack hesitated, pulling his hands away. "Where's Baby Tooth?" Tooth looked puzzled. "She's with her sisters," she said, "manning the Tooth Palace while I'm here. They've missed her." Jack nodded. "Of course," he said, looking over at Jaime. "I just don't feel like I should relay the story without everyone here. Besides, Sandy is still asleep." He'll stay that way for a while," Bunny said. "Poor guy. He's been restraining the time fragment for months, getting weaker by each day. One of us can catch him up later, if you don't want to." Jack stared at him. "All this time?" he asked weakly. The Guardians nodded, and Jack felt his chest sting with guilt. Sure, he'd tried to be fast, but he knew he could have been faster. Those last few days, he could have at least spared Sandy that. What was worse, he had a feeling he wouldn't have done anything differently if he'd known. Tooth put a hand on his shoulders. "No one is to blame here, Jack," she said. "We all did everything we could. And look, we're all in one piece." She smiled, though there was something in her eyes, as if she could see right into his memories. Jack walked over to Jaime as an excuse to step away from Tooth. Surely her powers didn't go that far. Or else the struggle to get his teeth back would have been pointless. No, Tooth couldn't read his thoughts, but that didn't mean she couldn't read him. "There's a lot to tell," Jack mumbled. "Dragons, Vikings, the Snow Queen, who, yes, turned out to be real, but not very keen on helping out." He snorted, absently running his fingers through Jaime's hair. Then he smiled. "I've also figured out some things about my family. Jaime will wake up soon. We'll tell you then." He turned to see the Guardians all looking at him scrutinizingly. "You must be tired," Tooth said soothingly. "Get some rest with good conscience, Jack. I can't imagine how tough it's been, going through this all by yourself." Her words were jarring, somehow. Jack blinked. He started, once he managed to find his voice again, and tried for a smile. "I was never by myself." He was going to say something more, but his throat closed up. Whatever the Guardians made of that, he didn't look up to figure it out. He heard North walk over and put a heavy hand on Jack's back. "Let's get the crystal somewhere safe," he said. "I know just the place." North led him down to the deepest part of the workshop, and Jack spent most of it looking around and ignoring how everything seemed just a little more disheveled. The workshop had always been chaotic, but it had always been a sort of organized mess. The clutter lying around used to be parts for toys, glitter, gift wrappings, and often stray rollerblades for people to slip in if they weren't careful. Now it was papers, strewn about books, even some feathers that Jack recognized the Tooth as if she'd been sitting there and tugging them out in frustration. He decided to focus on greeting everyone they passed instead. He wouldn't lie to himself. He knew he was putting on a smile to avoid the elephant in the room, but the elves and the Yetis did a good job at distracting him. Then they got to the elevator. It started descending and kept descending for a long time. We tried finding you, North said after a few moments. Jack looked up at him and saw that his face had fallen, a guilty shadow hanging over it. I know, Jack said, but there was nothing you could do. I know that now. North looked back at him, his gentle blue eyes suddenly piercing. If his expression had just been a tad more brutal, he might have reminded him of stoic. Jack looked away. Usually there was a view from the elevator, but now it was just an icy blue wall. How deep does this go? Deep enough, North said, a bit ominously. The elevator descended into an underground cave and came to a stop. Torches lit up the room, though Jack was fairly convinced nobody had been down here for a long while. It was deathly quiet, aside from the soft melody of water droplets. There were a few tunnel openings, and judging by the echo, they stretched out deep into the ice. Knowing they were surrounded by ice and the Arctic Ocean beyond that, it was claustrophobic to say the least. And you made this place because? Jack asked, and wasn't sure why he kept his voice down. It just seemed appropriate. Well, you never know, North said, walking out of the elevator, and that was that on that. I remember you suggested making a new crystal. I told you no, but I would not put it past you to try anyway. But that is not how you got this one, was it? Jack shook his head, putting a hand on the satchel. It's the same crystal I found in the cave, he said, even quieter than before. We just collected the pieces. North hummed. He gestured for Jack to follow, and they walked into one of the tunnels. After passing a few forks in the path, Jack decided he didn't want to try his chances navigating this place alone, if he, for whatever ungodly reason, ever wanted to come back down here. If we managed to trap the time fragment again, we would need some place to secure it, North explained as they entered a small room at the end of the tunnel. By the opposite wall there was a silver box. No, a chest, slightly ajar. So I built this. Once we close it, there is no way to open it again. Jack wanted to argue that hiding the crystal at the North Pole should be secure enough. But then he remembered that it had been overtaken before. Then he wanted to argue that they shouldn't put it in a box that could never be opened. What if they needed it someday? But quickly realized that there would never be a situation that called for such a dangerous risk. Unless what? He knew he was just trying to come up with excuses, so maybe he one day could go back in time, back to Burke, back to Hiccup. But that was never going to happen. More so than keeping the crystal safe from potential enemies, he had to keep it safe from himself. He walked up to the chest and untied the satchel around his waist. He pulled a sleeve over his hand and took the crystal out, meaning to put it into the chest, but couldn't seem to move. He wanted to ask North if there really was no way to open it again, if he hadn't hidden away some emergency key somewhere. But he looked at the chest and saw that there was no keyhole, and North sounded grave. He meant what he had said. Jack's hand clenched around the crystal, willing himself to put it into the chest. It felt like he was watching his own body when he let go and retracted his hand, only realizing he'd been holding his breath when the chest closed shut. The sharp noise it made sent a jolt through him, and he closed his eyes. As quietly as he could, he exhaled, hoping North didn't hear how much his breath quavered. The echo from the chest faded. He turned around. North looked carefully at him, confusion and worry poorly concealed on his face. When Jack didn't move, he slowly approached him. "What is wrong, Jack?" he asked gently. It was all it took. Jack knew he wouldn't be able to keep his composure come the moment any of the Guardians asked that exact question, and he knew one of them would, because he knew the grief he felt was too great to conceal. And in its inevitability, he was grateful that North had waited until they were alone, deep in the ice of the North Pole, before asking. Jack felt his lips tremble and his eyes sting, and he could only shake his head. His chest hurt too much to speak. North pulled him into his arms, and Jack hid his face in his chest. The last time he'd sobbed like this had been on the docks with Hiccup. The thought only made him sob harder. They sat down there for a long time as Jack waited to calm down, wiping frozen tears off his cheeks. North didn't try to ask any questions. He rubbed Jack's back and didn't seem to mind the silence nor the cold. He showed no sign of impatience whenever Jack was hit by a new wave of emotion. "Are you sure you want to go back to the others?" North asked when they were in the elevator again. "You can be alone if you want." Jack shook his head at the last question. "I don't want to be alone." He swallowed with difficulty and inhaled deeply, steadying his breath. I want to stay with Jaime until he wakes up. North nodded. Okay. He took a deep breath as well. Then I will make some hot chocolate, or maybe something cold for you, a smoothie. Do you have meat? Jack asked before he could stop himself. The bewildered look North gave him made him laugh. Just kidding, he said, but wasn't entirely sure if he was. They parted ways, North heading off to the kitchen, while Jack went back to the others. Sandy was still sleeping, as was Jaime. Bunny was, predictably, scowling at an egg while putting down what was undoubtedly some intricate details, while Tooth was kneeling by Jaime's side. Jack thought she was only brushing through his hair, but as he got closer, he saw that her hand wasn't moving and her eyes were closed in concentration. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his chest suddenly constricting with panic. Tooth opened her eyes just as Jack grabbed her wrist. Don't make him forget. Don't make him forget too." "I'm not," Tooth quickly said, holding her hands up in surrender. Jack stared at her, then looked at Jaime, who seemed no different than before. He let go of Tooth's wrist, slowly meeting her eyes again. Tooth looked evenly back at him, gently placing a hand on his. "I'm only softening the blow a little," she explained. "Not altering any memories, but he's been through a lot. He'll remember it, but it will feel far enough away that he won't—" She trailed off, weighing her words. "Oh, I see," Jack mumbled before she could continue. He looked back at Jaime. "That he won't suffer from it. He's been having some bad dreams." "Sandy will help him with those," Tooth said. Jack nodded. "That's good," he murmured. He glanced over his shoulder at Bunny, who was watching him with obvious concern. Jack sighed and leaned heavily against the couch. "Sorry, I'm just a bit tense." "That's one word for it," Bunny mumbled. "Bunny," Tooth scolded before turning to Jack again. "Jack, if you want to talk—" "I can't," Jack interrupted. He smiled apologetically. "Not yet. But I'll tell you once it hurts a little less." It wasn't like Jack had to be open enough to even admit that he was hurting. At least it wasn't like old Jack. But he changed, and that was clear to all of them. He changed, and Jack thought things would never feel the same again. Jaime came to slowly. His body felt like it was filled with lead, but he managed to blink his eyes open, groaning weakly. As he tried focusing, a blurry face appeared in front of him, and he blinked until he saw who it was. "Sleep well?" Jack asked cheerfully. Jaime stared at him. Behind him, a fire was crackling softly. There was a smell. Was it hot chocolate? And Jaime was comfortable. When was the last time he'd slept somewhere soft and warm? He sat up suddenly, looking around. "Jack," he whispered, as if saying it out loud would break the spell. "We're in Santa's workshop." "We are," Jack agreed, dropping onto the couch beside him. "Do you want some hot chocolate? North left it here for you." Jaime pulled his eyes away from the giant globe floating mid-air and looked at Jack. Jack's smile softened, and he nodded. "We're back." "It's not just a vision?" Jaime asked. Jack leaned over the table and grabbed the mug waiting there, handing it to Jaime. "See for yourself," he said. Jaime reached for the mug as if it were being offered a priceless gift. He carefully took the handle and let out a shaky laugh when he didn't pass through it. He took a careful sip, expecting it to be cold, but it was just the right temperature. Also the best hot chocolate Jaime had ever tasted, if it wasn't just because he hadn't had anything sweet in months. It almost brought him to tears. He put the mug back on the table before throwing himself at Jack. Jack laughed and returned the hug. "How long was I out?" Jaime asked as he pulled away. "It's been a few hours," Jack said. "North insisted we have a feast to celebrate, so the others are in the kitchen. Well, not Sandy, he's—" His eyes glanced over Jaime's shoulder, and Jaime turned around to see the Sandman snoozing peacefully in one of the armchairs. "Is he okay?" Jaime asked. "He will be." Jaime turned back around, peeking up at Jack. "Are you okay?" Jack's mouth opened, then closed again. He nodded. Jaime could see it wasn't entirely true, but he knew Jack well enough to understand that this wasn't the time to pry. Instead, he hugged him again, burying his face in Jack's neck. "Thank you," he murmured. Jack said nothing, but squeezed him tightly, his hand on the back of Jaime's head. "How are you feeling?" Jack asked after a minute or so. "Do you want another tour of the workshop? I'm sure Phil will be happy to see you." Jaime thought about it, waiting to be excited. Instead, he just felt faint guilt from the fact that he wasn't. He sat back, glancing at Sandy, then at the globe, listening to the bustling of the workshop below. "Will I ever come back here again?" he asked quietly. Jack was silent for a moment before putting a hand on Jaime's knee. "Do you want to go home?" he asked back. Jaime nodded, though he felt bad for doing it. He didn't know if any other child in the world had ever gotten to see the workshop, and here he was turning the offer down. Sure, he'd seen it before, but he still felt ungrateful. "Well," Jack said, "you're not supposed to be here. Pretty sure it's against the rules." Jaime glanced up at him. Jack smiled slowly. "But you've been a part of this world for so long, I think you deserve the right to stay," he continued, "if you want to." He glanced over his shoulder and leaned in close. "Besides, since becoming a guardian, I've pretty much memorized all the ways in and out, and Phil likes you. He'll turn a blind eye." Jaime had a feeling the guardians wouldn't actually forbid Jaime to come back if Jack wanted him there, but he still felt himself grin elfishly. In the end, after Jaime had changed into his old clothes, he and Jack snuck into North's office and stole his magical snow globe. Jaime left a note on his desk saying thank you and that he hoped he could see them again, but that he wanted to see his mom as quickly as possible. His hope was that the Guardians would accept a rain check and invite him to the North Pole another time. Did that make him spoiled? Maybe, but hope had never hurt before. Well, at least it hadn't hurt him. The portal deposited them right by Jack's pond. Jaime had to take a moment to take it all in. Burgess, finally looking the way it was supposed to. At least in Jaime's eyes. Meanwhile, Jack's pond looked not different exactly. It felt different, though. It was dark, which probably made the pond look even more mysterious. Jack only glanced at it before sending Jaime a curious look. "It's just a bit strange," Jaime said, suddenly self-conscious. "After all that?" Jack's face softened as if he was relieved. "Yeah, it is, a bit," he agreed. He nodded in the direction of the neighborhoods. "Are you ready?" Jaime swallowed thickly and nodded. They talked about how they wanted to do this. Jaime had suggested going to the police and making up some story, but they quickly threw that idea out. None of them knew enough about the modern adult world to spin a convincing enough lie. Besides, lying to the police was probably not a good thing. Jack had suggested he feign amnesia, but Jaime knew he wouldn't be able to keep his mouth shut for long. Besides, he couldn't lie to his mother. He didn't want to lie to his mother. "Just get me to my room," Jaime whispered as they approached his house. "Through my window." "Shouldn't you at least use the front door?" Jack asked. "No, it's better this way." Jack looked confused, but he shrugged and grabbed Jaime by his arms, flying up to the second floor. He landed on the roof outside the window and made a swiping motion with his hand. The latch on the window opened. "Should I be worried that it's so easy for you to break in?" Jaime whispered as Jack helped him climb inside. Jack shrugged again. "Maybe," he whispered. He got quiet, crouching in the windowsill as Jaime took careful steps into his bedroom. It looked almost exactly the same as it had, how many months ago? Maybe just a little tidier. Jaime swallowed down the tide rising in his throat. He turned back to Jack. "What about you?" Jack frowned. "What about me?" he asked innocently. When Jaime didn't budge, he sighed, lowering his gaze. "I'll be fine, honestly," he smiled, trailing the pattern on his staff. "I won't lie to you and say I am fine. Not yet. But I existed for a long time with nothing at all to hang on to. At least I have the memories this time, and they'll always be there, so..." He nodded, looking back at Jaime. "I will be fine." Jaime's throat hurt. "I don't want you to be alone," he whispered. Jack stepped off the windowsill and landed soundlessly on the floor, where he crouched and brought Jaime into a tight hug. "I won't be," he said, and when he pulled away, his eyes were rimmed with tears. "This adventure hasn't been easy, but I'm still glad it happened. I wouldn't have found out about my family's heritage otherwise." Jaime laughed softly. "I'm glad it happened too." The corners of Jack's eyes crinkled. He stood and made to leave. "Jack," Jaime said. He resolutely tilted his chin up when Jack turned around. "I mean what I said. Maybe we couldn't make Stoic believe, but I will make my mom believe." Jack tilted his head to the side. "You're stubborn about this," he commented. "We're family," Jaime said. "If anyone can see you, it's us." Just then, the door behind Jaime opened. He caught a glimpse of Jack's eyes widening before Jaime's body whirled around on its own. Joy stood in the doorway. She was in her nightgown, her hair in disarray. Obviously, she'd just been fast asleep. Judging by her expression, she probably thought she was still asleep. Jaime? She whispered. Jamie's chest twisted at the sound of his mom's voice. Mom, he replied, his voice breaking. Joyce's expression seemed to fall apart. She rushed forward and fell to her knees as she brought Jaime into her arms. Jaime had never seen his mom cry like this before, and the next minutes seemed to blur away. He only knew that his mom was holding him, and that he was home, and that he was okay. Or that he would be okay. Oh, Jaime, Joyce sobbed, cupping his cheeks and looking him over. Her lips quivered with what Jaime believed was 1,000 questions. Instead, she just hugged him again and kissed his forehead desperately. You're okay. You're okay. Mom, Jaime said, his voice quaking with a mix between joy and embarrassment. I'm okay. It's okay. I'm sorry. Who were you talking to? Jaime blinked. Upon seeing his mom, he had completely forgotten about Jack, and he quickly turned around. But Jack was gone. The window still stood open, and one of the window panes had frosted over. Something was written on it. A message written in runes. See you soon, little brother. Jaime narrowed his eyes. Jack wasn't making this easy. If he'd written in English, it might have helped him, but he was scared to hope, Jaime knew. There was only one thing to do about that. He turned around and hugged Joyce again. Mom, he said, can you promise me something? Joyce was quiet for a moment. She leaned back to look at him. Depends what it is, she said, brushing hair out of her face. Is something wrong? Well, not exactly, Jaime said, but I need you to believe what I tell you, what happened, how I came back, and most importantly, who got me back. It's going to be hard to believe, but you have to try. Joyce looked confused, a hesitant smile tugging on her mouth. The fact that you're here is already a miracle, she murmured, brushing a thumb over his cheek. Unless I'm dreaming. You're not dreaming, Jaime reassured her. A couple more tears ran down Joyce's face, and she hugged Jaime again. Then I'll believe every word you tell me, she whispered. Jack went back to his pond. He stopped at the edge of the moonlit water, watching the silvery reflections. The corners of his eyes felt stiff. It was likely the only reason why he'd learned how to hold in his tears, since there was never a point in hiding them from others. They had an annoying tendency to freeze before they got very far. He was happy to see Jaime reunited with his mother. He was happy to see Joyce too, and for the first time take note of everything she had in common with Emily, and even Jack himself. Maybe he was imagining it, but the thought was comforting anyway. At least he still had that victory. He was happy that he had accomplished what he had promised, despite all his doubts and fears. But there was always a but. Jack stepped forward. The water froze beneath him as he touched the surface. Maybe he shouldn't do this in the middle of... what month was it anyway? Definitely not a winter month, that was for sure. He hoped Jaime wouldn't catch another cold because of the sudden change in temperature. As for the pond, he was fairly sure the people of Burgess already had a feeling there was something special about it. Strange things tended to happen around this pond. He supposed that was why he lingered, instead of going back to the pole. It was his pond, the place he'd called home for 3 centuries, where his journeys both started and ended. It felt like the only place he could be right now. The ice spread out from his feet to the edges of the pond, the frost inching just beyond the water and into the earth. It wasn't entirely intentional, but Jack couldn't bring himself to care. The fact that he had self-control enough to stop it from snowing was already noteworthy. The ice thickened beneath him. He was trailing his staff across it, making swirling, glowing patterns when he felt the wind rustle his cloak and hair. He smiled softly. At least you're still here, he mumbled to it. The wind seemed to caress his face like it was trying to comfort him before going still. Jack closed his eyes. The world was suddenly very, very quiet. Looks like you made it home safely. Jack opened his eyes. He stared blankly ahead, though the voice had come from behind him. It couldn't be real. He'd hallucinated before when he'd been at his loneliest. It couldn't be real. He couldn't allow himself that hope. And yet he found himself turning around. A figure stood by the center of the pond. He wore a cloak made of brown fur and leather armor. His hair was dark and unruly, his eyes were a brilliant green, and instead of a left leg, there was a metal prosthetic. It was Hiccup, but it couldn't be Hiccup. Jack dimly registered that he was staring, speechless, when the boy that looked like Hiccup inclined his head slightly sideways, his mouth turning into a nervous smile.
Jack?"
Hearing his own name in Hiccup's voice felt like falling from the sky. It was wonderful and terrible at the same time. He wouldn't hope, not again. This was just some trick of his mind, some cruel dream born from overexposure to Sandy's dream sand. Jack opened his mouth, but each time he thought he was going to speak, the words perished on the tip of his tongue.
"Don't be scared,"
the boy who looked like Hiccup said, holding up 2 trembling hands. If any of them were scared, it was him.
"I'm not,"
Jack said. His voice was barely there.
"I'm confused."
The boy who looked like Hiccup smiled a little. He took a step forward, but stopped when Jack tensed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jack beat him to it.
Is this real?"
The boy who looked like Hiccup laughed softly.
"I find it hard to believe myself. Standing here, talking with you, actually talking."
His voice quavered faintly, the way Hiccup's voice tended to do when he was nervous.
"But yes, it's real. It's me, Jack."
Jack closed his eyes again. When he opened them, the boy who claimed he was Hiccup was still there. But it couldn't be Hiccup. Even if he looked exactly like Hiccup, the same age as when Jack had left him, the same wind-swept hair, the same eyes that seemed to hold the whole sky in them, there was something different about him. And it wasn't just the outfit. He seemed older, somehow. Much older. The boy who looked like Hiccup started, his arms gesticulating half-heartedly by his sides.
"I've been going through this moment in my head a few times. Many times. Like 1,000 times, probably. I've always imagined myself a lot smoother than this. I mean, it started off well. That home journey thing I'd been planning for a while. And even that wasn't as cool as I thought it."
"How are you here?" Jack interrupted. He took a tentative step towards him, then another. You were supposed to live. You promised you would live."
"I did."
The boy who looked like Hiccup held up his hand soothingly, taking a step towards Jack as well, slowly, like Jack was a cornered animal.
"I lived a whole life, I promise."
"Then how?" Jack started, but his voice broke away. Again, he had to close his eyes, and he shook his head.
"Don't,"
he pleaded.
"I can't. Not again."
He gasped when he felt fingers brush against his own and looked up to find Hiccup in front of him. Jack's hand reacted on his own, reaching out to Hiccup's. Hiccup's mouth parted, his breath coming out in shaky puffs of mist. Jack knew that reaction well, the shock of touching after going without it for a long time. How long had he waited?
"Hiccup,"
Jack whispered, feeling his eyes widen and refill with tears. Hiccup looked up as if Jack had slapped him. Then he smiled, almost incredulously, and nodded. Jack's staff clattered onto the ice. He threw his arms around Hiccup just as his legs went out beneath him, and the two of them sank onto their knees. Jack wasn't sure if he was laughing or crying, or if the words he tried to speak were in any way coherent. He felt Hiccup's arms around him, strong and desperate and familiar, his chest all but heaving against Jack's. Jack leaned away and put his hands on Hiccup's cheeks, checking again if it really was him. And it was. There was no doubt in it. Jack hadn't even been aware he'd memorized the exact location of each one of his freckles, but here they were, just as they had been centuries ago. And there was the scar on his chin, and his bushy eyebrows, and his big round nose. A laugh, partly sob, bubbled out of him. He kissed his nose, then his forehead, then his cheek. Hiccup began to laugh too, but stopped when Jack pressed their lips together. Jack felt a tear trail onto his hand. He broke the kiss, but didn't move away. The only reason he dared open his eyes again was because he could hear and feel Hiccup in front of him. He wasn't an illusion or a dream. He was real, and he was here. Jack brushed the tear away with his thumb. "How?" he whispered. Hiccup cracked his eyes open. The green seemed even brighter against the faint red at the corners. He put a hand over Jack's and closed them again, leaning into his touch.
"It's a long, somewhat confusing story," he murmured. "It might take some time to wrap your head around it."
"I have time," Jack said. Hiccup's lips pulled up into a smile. He moved his hand to the back of Jack's head and kissed him again.
"I know," he said. "So do I."
Jack began to grin, but faltered. "You do?" he said, pulling back a little to look down at Hiccup's outfit and then back up at him. "Why is that?" Hiccup's eyes brightened.
"I guess I should reintroduce myself," he said, and moved a little more away just to give a half-hearted bow. "Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III, protector of the Northmost winds and skies. It's a mouthful, I know, as if my name wasn't long enough already, but I didn't really have a say in it."
He nodded up at the moon.
"You're a spirit,"
Jack said.
People used to say I had the heart of a chief and the soul of a dragon,
Hiccup said, his eyes glazing over for a moment, like he was pulling forward an old memory. By now, Jack understood that was exactly the case, but he couldn't imagine it. He'd just said goodbye to Hiccup a few hours ago.
I spent my life fighting for the dragons in our coexistence. I've spent my second life doing the same, plus some extra responsibilities.
But the dragons, Jack started reluctantly.
Hiccup looked back at him. The dragons, he agreed, a certain familiar light in his eyes. They're still waiting. Which reminds me, I know a guy who's been aching to see you again.
Jack stared at him. You're joking, he decided. Hiccup snorted. He looked up and made a strange noise. It hardly sounded human. It sounded like it was supposed to come from a... The same noise echoed from above. Jack looked up, and at first all he saw was the dark, starry sky. But then some of them began blinking out in succession, and Jack gaped as moonlight fell upon the shadow shooting towards them. Toothless landed elegantly on the ice. You're flying on your... Jack started, but didn't get any further before his vision was filled with dragon. Toothless knocked Jack over, and Jack gave an undignified shriek, which then turned into a cackle as he tried to shield himself against Toothless's tongue. Hiccup did little to help him. It wasn't until Jack was all but dripping that Toothless allowed himself to be pushed away, and he grinned wildly at Jack, tongue hanging over his toothless gums. He looked just the same as well, except for the matching black tail fins and some extra flaps across his back. Jack shook his head, unable to stop grinning. Toothless, how can you be a spirit too? Toothless all but purred, raising his head proudly.
You say it as if you've never met an animal spirit before,
Hiccup commented, amused. He ran a hand over Toothless's head and gently pressed their foreheads together.
We're the bridge between human and dragon kind. I guess I sort of always knew I'd end up here with him, on some subconscious level.
Jack peered at him. How is this real? He asked faintly. Hiccup crouched beside him, and Toothless lay his head in Jack's lap, looking expectantly up at him until Jack started scratching his neck.
Surely not the strangest thing you've experienced?
Hiccup grinned. Jack looked up at him, studying his face. He reached up with his free hand and cupped his cheek. What happened? He asked. After we left. Hiccup nuzzled Jack's hand instead of immediately replying. The movement struck Jack as almost animalistic, like the way Toothless had leaned into Jack's touch just before they left. As if Hiccup had spent so much time with just Toothless, he'd adopted some of his behavior.
It's hard to describe,
he said, his eyes growing distant again.
I remember my life, clearly too, but at the same time it's far away. It's me, but at the same time...
He trailed off uncertainly. Like Jack Frost isn't, but still is, the same person as Jackson Overland, Jack supplied. I get it. Hiccup met his eyes, and it was his turn to study Jack. Then he took his hand and got to his feet, pulling Jack with him and ignoring Toothless's protests.
Let us show you, he said, what we've been up to in the past, 1,000 years, give or take.
Jack frowned, holding Hiccup back before he could mount Toothless. Were you alone? He asked. Hiccup's eyes softened.
Never,
he said, squeezing Jack's hand.
Come on, you should join me and Toothless, or you might get lost.
Lost? Jack repeated, a bit offended, but followed Hiccup. I thought you said Northmost. North, cold. Do you know who I am?
And yet you had never been to Burke,
Hiccup pointed out, jumping easily onto Toothless like he weighed nothing. Jack levitated, but didn't sit down immediately. He peered at Hiccup. But Burke isn't... Hiccup's smile was smug.
Gods, it feels good to know something you don't for once, he said.
Toothless didn't wear a saddle anymore, but that didn't matter. They weren't dependent on each other to fly anymore, but that didn't matter either. They both preferred to do it like old times as much as possible, and now Jack was with them too. Hiccup felt like he was dreaming. He could only imagine what Jack was feeling. He hadn't even had time to prepare for this reunion like Hiccup had. Jack sat behind Hiccup, his arms secured around his waist like they both were still human. The world around them turned unfocused as they flew, moving through the plane which only spirits could navigate. Meanwhile, Hiccup started telling Jack his story. He'd lived a full life. It wasn't painless, and it wasn't always how he'd expected it would be. He'd found things, and he'd lost things. He'd been happy, and he'd been devastated. But it had been a good life, which came to an end when it was supposed to. That was strange to think about now. Those years as chief felt as clear as yesterday, and as distant and hazy as childhood memories. precious and personal, but also like they belonged to a completely different person. "But why do you look like this?" Jack asked.
"Like a teenager?"
Hiccup scratched his cheek.
"I don't know for sure. The moon isn't very talkative like that."
"I'll drink to that," Jack commented under his breath.
"I woke up and at first I didn't remember anything," Hiccup said. "I knew I was Hiccup and I felt like I did when you were with me, though I didn't realize it at the time. So I'm not sure, but I think I am the version of myself that I was when I decided to protect the magical world."
Jack leaned over his shoulder, studying his face. "Do you feel like an 18-year-old? He asked with an amused glint in his eyes.
"Do you feel like an 18-year-old?
Hiccup shot back. Jack sank down on Hiccup's shoulder, leaning against his neck. "I see your point," he mumbled. His breath tickled Hiccup's skin and sent a shiver down his spine. At last, the clouds parted.
"We're here,"
Hiccup announced. Jack perked up. "There's just ocean," he said slowly. Hiccup put a hand on his cheek.
"Look again."
Jack's eyelashes fluttered against Hiccup's little finger. Then he gasped. Berg appeared far beneath them. It didn't look the same as when Hiccup lived there. No human had lived there for a long, long time. As for animals and other creatures, that was another story. "I can feel it," Jack breathed. "The archipelago. Has it been here all along?" Hiccup glanced at him, smiling at his awestruck expression.
"The archipelago is packed with magical beings, as you know. More than anywhere in the world, as far as I know. That's why nobody knows it's there, and why someone needs to look after it."
"The archipelago is in good hands," Jack muttered. "Freya, that's what she said. She was talking about you?" The memory blossomed to life in Hiccup's mind. He mentally dusted it off, and suddenly his cheeks felt very hot.
"I guess she was,"
he mumbled sheepishly. They flew towards Berg, but not where the village used to be. Even after all this time, Hiccup felt the sting of loss seeing how much this island had changed. He'd often wondered if that was why the memories seemed distant. It was a way to protect himself and to move on.
"Come on,"
Hiccup said. Then he slid off Toothless and let himself fall, feeling a little too much satisfaction at Jack's panicked yelp. He fell and then spread his arms out. The flaps on his flight suit sprang out, perfected from the first time Jack saw it in action, and then he was gliding smoothly along the wind. Jack appeared beside him, his eyes wide.
"You can control the wind,"
he yelled. Hiccup smiled playfully.
"I can control a wind," he corrected. "There are many wind sprites, but only one wind spirit. Like someone once said, I'm sort of the boss."
Jack's mouth hung open. Hiccup could see the gears turning in his head, but before he could figure it out, they had to hit the brakes before they crash-landed. Hiccup touched down easily, but Jack stumbled a little, looking a bit out of it. He turned around, taking in his surroundings. "Where's Toothless?" he asked.
"He'll be back,"
Hiccup said, waving a hand.
"He has stuff to do. Dragons to look after, winds to command, that kind of stuff."
Jack looked puzzled. "You have the same job?" Hiccup scratched his head.
"Sometimes it feels like we're the same person," he admitted. "Two sides of the same coin and all."
Jack continued to stare at him. He was still confused. One didn't need to know him as well as Hiccup to see it. But now there was something underneath that, a slow realization. Hiccup gestured for Jack to join him and sit by the cliff edge.
"Remember this place?"
he asked. "Of course." Jack carefully sat down beside him, still with that searching look. "It just looks a little different, but this is where we first talked, right? And where I rode Toothless for the first time. Consciously, anyway." Hiccup laughed, his mind ringing with a clear yet distant memory.
"You finally told me a little about yourself," he said, "so I thought it was appropriate to come here to talk."
He paused, but Jack was quiet, waiting for him to continue. Hiccup turned to the ocean and took a deep breath.
"When I woke up as a wind spirit, I found out pretty fast that it had been a while since Hiccup's horrendous headache was chief. The archipelago was already different. It was hazy at first, and I remembered things very slowly. Still, I always knew what to do, in the same way you always knew what to do as Jack Frost."
Jack frowned. "But haven't you been lonely?" he asked, his voice small. "How long have you waited?"
"That's where things get a bit confusing," Hiccup said. "I'm not always awake, I guess. There are times when I'm dormant. I'm around to make sure the archipelago and the dragons are safe and to make sure the wind sprites don't go off the rails. I've been a spirit for a while, but I'm not always, corporeal. Time feels different in that form.
Jack's brows twitched. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out.
It's a lot to take in,
Hiccup mumbled self-consciously. No, it's fine, Jack said, but there was a strain in his voice, like he was afraid. It's just, do you choose to do that? To go dormant? Oh. Hiccup leaned in and kissed his cheek.
I won't leave you, he promised. Not after waiting for 300 years.
Jack blinked. 300?
And some more.
Hiccup smiled sheepishly.
I didn't forget, not completely anyway. There was this drawing. I think it was Jaime's work.
Jack brought a hand towards his mouth. A gesture Hiccup knew he'd picked up from Jaime. Oh no, he muttered. That was my Christmas gift from him. I can't believe I forgot it.
Maybe it was meant to be, Hiccup said. That's what I choose to believe anyway. I found it and I just knew it was important, but I could never figure out why. And then, centuries later, I see you.
He paused, taking in Jack's face.
Jackson Overland and Emily Overland.
Jack's jaw went slack.
You were sitting on a hilltop, Hiccup continued, building something. A castle, I think. You kept hurting your fingers. I hope you got a little handier after working in the forge.
Jack laughed suddenly. It was a wobbly sound.
You were there?
He asked. Hiccup's chest twisted. They were getting awfully close to the only part of this reunion he'd been dreading.
You said the wind was a friend of yours, he murmured. I didn't recognize you at the time, but I felt like you were talking to me, like you knew. But after that, I lost track of you. When I came back, Jackson Overland was gone, and then, a few years later, I saw Jack Frost and...
His voice faltered. That memory was as clear as ever.
It all came back, all at once. You, Jaime Babytooth, the Snow Queen, as if it had just happened. And Jack, I swear.
He glanced at Jack, who was staring at him, his face blank with surprise. Hiccup swallowed heavily and turned fully to him, taking both hands in his own.
You were in so much pain, but I didn't want to risk changing anything, he said. If you saw me, you'd recognize me once you went back in time. I didn't know.
I understand, Jack interrupted, voice faint. He closed his eyes and slowly began to smile. You were there. You were always there, weren't you? Hiccup hesitated.
Not in a creepy way, he mumbled.
Jack's smile wavered, like he was holding back a laugh. There were joyous tears in his eyes when he opened them.
You're the wind, he said. That wind. All the time I spent talking to it, I was talking to you.
Hiccup smiled uncertainly.
I tried making myself as clear as possible, he said. Not that easy when you're just, wind. But I hoped it would make you a little less alone.
Jack kissed him. I love you, he murmured against his lips. Speaking of spending a bunch of time in wind form, Hiccup felt as if his body was dissolving. He melted against Jack, holding his hands close to his chest.
I've tried saying that 1,000 times, he whispered.
He met Jack's eyes, smiling helplessly.
I love you.
Jack had the audacity to look embarrassed. I see that now, he said with a small laugh. He pressed his forehead to Hiccup's, squeezing his hands tightly. I see you.
I see you too,
Hiccup replied softly. There was more to tell, lots more, a whole life, if Jack wanted to know. A whole second life, too. There was the magical world of the archipelago to show off, and there were winds and skies to experience anew together. But right now, it was enough to just exist, reveling in the fact that they were together again.
How's Jaime?
Hiccup asked after a few minutes. His head was resting on Jack's shoulder, and Jack was playing with his hair. Just saw him off, Jack said. He's with his family again. It was a tearjerker.
Do you think I could see him someday?
I don't see why not. He'll be overjoyed. Jack pressed his face into Hiccup's hair. Hiccup was so comfortable, he felt almost offended when Jack suddenly jolted. The feast! Hiccup blinked.
Feast?
The Guardians wanted to celebrate our return, but Jaime wanted to go home, so I was just going to see him off and come back, Jack recounted hastily. But then, I got a bit distracted, obviously. Hiccup hummed.
Sorry.
Yeah, you sounded, Jack said sarcastically. He got to his feet and pulled Hiccup up. Then he took something out of his satchel, a snow globe. You ever jumped through a magic portal? Hiccup sent the snow globe a wary look.
I'm pretty sure I'm not invited, he said slowly.
I'm inviting you, Jack said. We're celebrating our victory. You're part of that hour.
It's just a bit daunting. I'd need a heads up, I think. The big 5.
He puffed up his cheeks and exhaled. Shut up, Jack snorted, his smile self-conscious. He took a step closer. When's the last time you had a decent meal anyway?
I think never,
Hiccup admitted. Jack held up the snow globe, whispered to it, then threw it. A glowing, flickering portal opened up in the air. I've met your family, he said, stepping towards the portal and dragging Hiccup with him. It's time you met mine.
What if they don't like me, though?
I can't believe you're like 1,000 years old and you're still self-conscious, Jack said. Maybe that's why you're physically 18. Hiccup gave him a long-suffering glare. Jack sighed and stepped closer, kissing his cheek. You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met, he murmured. They won't just like you. They'll love you. You'll fit right in. And in the 1 in a trillion chance they don't like you, which definitely won't happen, they just have to deal with it. He squeezed Hiccup's hand and beamed. There's an eternity ahead of us. Hiccup felt himself smile.
I guess I would meet them eventually anyway,
he said. Jack nodded and tugged on his arms. Come with me, he pleaded. Aside from his anxiety, which annoyingly hadn't changed from when he was human, Hiccup didn't really have any reservations against meeting the Guardians. Even if he had, he wouldn't have been able to resist Jack's excitement. He laughed.
Nowhere else I'd rather be,
he said. Jack's eyes gleamed. They jumped through the portal, hands still intertwined.